Hello and welcome to Fake Awake, a space for investigating what troubles us and finding out why. I'm your host, Jess Royer, and today we're going to talk about the supposed takeover perpetrated by women and girls in schools. I'm delighted to have you here with me as we address the feminization debate and what it reveals about our society's notion of gender. It is my opinion that the feminization debate must end, as it creates a cycle of blame in which everyone loses. I'm a big fan of science fiction, so I've watched a lot of Star Trek. If you're not familiar with the franchise at all, don't worry. I'm not about to spoil anything for you or bore you with a lengthy description of journeys through the sometimes war-ridden, sometimes idyllic futuristic galaxy. What I will draw attention to is the relationship one alien race called the Ferengi have to their, what they call, females, that mirrors the gender binary of Earthlings. And while I have reservations about using Ferengi as an example at all in this discussion, because they're extremely problematic on a number of levels, they'll serve my purpose as a parallel to what is happening on Earth, with the insistence that separation of the genders is beneficial to all, and that feminization is to blame for issues facing men or boys in schools. So let's go ahead. Ferengi are extremely paternalistic and misogynistic, which means that they don't believe their females should have a place in decision-making. Male Ferengi have strict control over their females' behavior, from not being allowed to earn income to whom they are allowed to marry. Ferengi also control what their females do with their bodies, such as what they're allowed to wear. In this case, their females are supposed to be naked, and the wearing of clothing is seen as repulsive and immoral. To me, the writers are poking fun at the arbitrary rules here on Earth regarding what is considered ladylike or proper for a woman. I'll end my reference to Star Trek here with a quote from one reoccurring Ferengi character, Quark. "We Ferengi know better. Women are the enemy, and we treat them accordingly. The key is to never let them get the upper hand." Up until recently, schooling was dominated by men. This domination extended to teaching staff, students, administrators, and curriculum writers. Bodies of authority such as scientists and the church made sure to publish material and send out messages that ensured women remained outside education. The stories about what women could do were belittling and oppressive. There is a word to describe these kinds of stories. It's hegemonic discourse. In the book, Educating the Other, Gender Power in Schooling, Petra explains that hegemonic discourse helps maintain the status quo because it internalizes social truths, making it impossible for people to think of any other way of living. In the case of gender, when we get repeating messages about the behavior of men and women, as in what they ought to do, we come to think of these messages as facts or truths. In addition, hegemonic discourse prevents conflict or dissent opinions because the opportunity or even conceptualization of a different way of being or believing is made impossible. I'll explain with an example of hegemonic discourse on gender in schooling from my own life. I think back to the elective courses in my high school. No girls took woodworking, and they weren't allowed to. This wasn't challenged. A seemingly innocent decision to divide course electives based on gender is actually fueled by some pretty deep assumptions about gender that should be questioned. Were girls just not interested in woodworking, so the issue never came up? Were they genuinely not interested? Or were they playing out a gender role that stated girls were too weak or gentle to be able to handle power tools or woodworking machinery? Either way, it's pretty clear that the blame is on the girls. In her book, Petra reflects on a similar phenomenon that was happening in the 90s, when girls were underachieving in science and physics. In this case, the curriculum was not under scrutiny, nor was teacher methodology. Instead, girls were asked to undertake a process of degendering in order to succeed in those classes. Again, it was up to the girls to figure out how to fit in. It was their gender that was to blame if they didn't succeed. Skelton and Francis tell us that in regards to education, early efforts of feminists tried to reveal how schools were systems designed for boys and men, as I mentioned earlier. The goal was to get girls and women a seat at the table. In the decades that followed, and even today, the media, bloggers, various stakeholders in education, and even some academics believe the shift is now in girls' favor. Maybe those feminist efforts work too well, because we're told that now our boys are underachieving in schools and male teachers are sinking in seas of women. To them, it appears as if girls and women now do have the upper hand. And while Earthmen might not be coming out and repeating Quark's exact words, that women are the enemy, the sentiment feels eerily similar when I read titles such as "Physical education classes will cure boys of feminization," "Masculinity under siege in schools, politics, online," "Education is becoming feminized, putting men off becoming teachers," and "Has feminized schooling contributed to the West's male crisis?" These types of articles are everywhere, and declare that there are various ways feminization is tainting education. Let's look first at the claim that women outnumber men in teaching. The numbers of women teachers in the US and Canada, according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in 2014, do indeed show larger numbers of women in teaching positions in the earlier grades, but less so in the higher grades, and this is consistent with gender roles. In the 2019 book, Teachers, Gender, and the Feminization Debate, Moreau states that, and I'm quoting here, "In contrast with a sweeping view of teaching as feminized across the board, women in teaching fluctuate considerably across national contexts, as well as across levels of education, subjects, and posts." What this means is that the so-called feminization problem is not happening everywhere in the world, but just in places where the gender binary says it should. As in, there are more women teachers in elementary and high schools in US and Canada because teaching children is considered similar to motherhood, and the low pay is consistent with expectations for jobs that women do. Let's turn now to academic achievement. In the book The Schooled Society, published in 2018, we see that boys in Canada were still scoring better in traditionally masculine subjects such as math and science. But when I was preparing for this episode, I noticed that there was one place that boys weren't doing so well: literacy and English classes. As a side note, I have to mention that just saying boys is too vague. We have to be specific because it's not all boys who are failing, as the media would like us to believe. So let's continue. In an article for the New England Reading Association Journal, Watson and Keller suggested that socioeconomic status, whether you're from a poor, middle, or high-income family, and reading habits outside the class are likely causes for boys' underachievement in school. They went on to say that assuming boys don't succeed in literacy just because they're boys is essentialist and doesn't problematize concepts of gender. Put simply, essentialism claims that something is the way it is because of certain properties. This can work for something like a table. But people aren't tables, and our personhood is very much shaped by our social experiences. So it doesn't make sense to say that boys don't like reading because they're boys. Instead, we have to look at what rules and expectations society places on children who happen to be boys in school taking English classes. These rules and expectations govern behavior, but not because they're laws of science, but because boys are socially expected to behave a certain way. Later on in The Schooled Society, a book I mentioned earlier, there is a section devoted to Marie Charles's idea that because students are given choices in schools, they will typically choose to go with what their gender roles dictate. Just framing the issue as a boy problem caused by feminization avoids looking at the real problems. It further divides boys and girls, men and women. That hegemonic discourse that keeps girls from succeeding in math or science also works against boys who may feel that English or reading isn't masculine. Finally, let's examine single-sex schools as a possible solution to increase academic achievement among boys. I'm using the term sex here because it's what's used in this study and others, but know that what should be used is the word gender instead. So a systematic review carried out by the U.S. Department of Education wanted to figure out whether or not single-sex schools were better than co-ed schools, and the results were mixed. I'm quoting now. It is more common to come across studies that report no difference between single-sex and co-ed schooling than to find outcomes with support for the superiority of co-ed schooling, and by extension, single-sex schooling. In Canada, from the Canadian Council on Learning, the author Capone asks why we even continue to divide along sex or gender lines, given that there are more differences in achievement scores between boys among themselves than differences in achievement scores between boys and girls. I'll quote Elliott and Halpern with their word on this topic. All boys and all girls instruction is a misguided fad, not a genuine solution for underachieving students, who would be better served with more educated, higher performing teachers and smaller class sizes. School should be a place where children learn to respect and appreciate each other regardless of gender, just as they will need to do in their future families and workplaces. In examining some of the areas in which feminization is said to ruin education, it's clear to me that the issue is gender getting mixed up with sex, and the whole problem of believing that there are distinct roles each gender must play, combined with the fact that one gender is valued above all. Time and time again, people who believe that feminization is ruining education turn to biological factors, with evidence that is shaky at best, and at worst are blowing the gender gap wide open after decades of efforts to achieve gender equity, reducing the opportunities for both boys and girls. From Watson and Keller again. What is occurring in the debate about the boys is a diversion of resources away from marginalized youth, who require specific support in schools, and a further entrenchment of beliefs that will have a lasting impact on gender equity. I think for me, what's truly terrifying about the feminization debate is the call for a return of traditional masculine values in education. It's not uncommon to wish to see people like you represented in teachers, leaders, pop stars, or in books. Undoubtedly, children who identify as racial, religious, or sexual minorities benefit from this. I'm tempted to say that boys deserve the same thing, but the feminization debate isn't just about boys seeing men as role models. The proposed solution to the feminization of schooling is masculinization of the traditional variety of the curriculum, and it is unquestionably violent. It's violent when it is said that feminization is making teaching too politically correct, because what is so wrong with speaking or acting with care? If we put aside the idea that political correctness is censorship, we can try to understand why someone might prefer certain words over others, or why certain actions are unwanted. It's violent when stories of struggle, discrimination, and racism are ignored or said to be uninteresting for boys because they need stories of heroes or of hunting. Some stories just aren't okay anymore because they're extremely problematic, or they promote colonial thinking, or create a sense of entitlement and inflated self-importance. All voices need to be heard, including Western voices, but we also need to get with the times. It's violent to teach boys that they concentrate better when there aren't girls around, because it depicts girls as the problem, a feeling that will be hard to remove once they enter adulthood. It's violent to teach boys that emotions are only for girls, and we can see how this repression plays out in physical violence, sexual violence, or mental illness and high suicide rates among men. It's violent that the feminization debate should include only talks of men and women, boys and girls, and not any other gender displays. It's violent to convince boys or anyone that separation is ever a solution. Aren't we fooling ourselves that things will work out fine? Finally, it's violent whenever we use language that extinguishes any possibility for different forms of expression. Traditional masculinity defines itself as whatever femininity isn't, and that's what this is all about. If women in education have brought with them care and respect for their students, inclusivity policies, anti-harassment and anti-bullying laws and regulations, then it is necessarily feminine and therefore not masculine, and thus not valued. Don't our children and youth deserve better? Don't they deserve to be given the chance to express themselves as they want and to pursue their academic interests without being oppressed by the adult world's obsession with gender roles? While gender is a construct, and hegemonic discourse on gender is basically just stories, it still feels very real, and has a profound impact on all our lives. As adults, we have immense responsibility to our youth and to future generations. We must end the feminization debate and stop pushing for separation. The general media and internet subcultures have a tendency to use perspectives from second-wave separatist feminism as if it represents all feminists and logically, by extension, all writing and effort that seeks to promote girls or women must thereby seek to exclude men. As a response, we're getting a pushback which paints boys and men as the victims of feminism or feminization. Perhaps we even need a new word to describe what feminism is trying to do, because for a lot of people, feminism doesn't mean equality or equity. In one piece I read online, the author, Mayrat, wrote, "To the delight of militant feminists hoping to topple the patriarchy, there is indeed a nationwide crisis of manhood." What kind of person actually takes delight in another's failings? Are you starting to see how these words, as they get repeated, really do turn women into the enemy? Watson and Kaler note that public panic has made this issue into a real problem. The problem is that feminization is being blamed when it shouldn't be. But I also believe that we should put blame aside. If any child is underachieving, let's instead find the help they need to do well and feel accepted. If men find they don't have a place in elementary or high schools, let's get teacher training programs to teach and explore gender issues so that both men and women can learn to accept the other. With men on one side blaming women and women on the other blaming men, we're only succeeding in breeding hate. Before my final comment, let's revisit the Star Trek analogy. I use the Ferengi to illustrate how the feminization debate makes me feel like we're going back in time with our talks on gender. The final line of that quote from Quark is, "It's all about control." The feminization debate feels like a fight to reassert control rather than an honest effort to help boys and men find a place in schools. What if instead we tried new ways of doing gender rather than romanticizing past versions? What if we tried to listen to each other rather than always trying to win? I'd like to end now with an idea from Dr. Ayrton, who is an assistant professor of gender and sexuality studies in education at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Dr. Ayrton notes that schools generally only react to situations involving gender as they arrive in a crisis state. The article The Gender-Friendly Classroom by Ayrton suggests instead that educators or parents, anyone working with children and youth, work from two standpoints on gender. I'll quote the article now. 1. Teach like it's a given that all your students' relationships with gender are ambivalent and will change over time. And 2. Teach like you already have transgender spectrum students, or students with transgender spectrum friends, family, or loved ones in your classroom. This way, from the get-go, we can challenge traditional notions of gender and not get tied up in another war between men and women, while our children suffer the consequences. We all wish to be validated or heard, and we deserve to be successful, but it shouldn't ever be at the expense of someone else. Using language that blames and excludes just keeps us in an echo chamber, never actually arriving at any solutions. For a list of sources for this episode, you can go to fakeawakepodcast.com. Peace and long life, everyone.